The rain had just stopped, leaving the world rinsed and waiting. A single road cut through the quiet hills, glistening under a thin, cold sun. Steam rose from the asphalt like breath, hesitant, human. At its edge, a woman stood beside a broken car. One hand rested on the door, the other held a folded piece of paper. A truck slowed, tires whispering against the wet gravel. Inside, Daniel, a single father, eyes shadowed by years of silence, hesitated before stepping out. She turned, lips moving without sound. Only the paper in her hands spoke, and in that moment, the road between them felt like more than distance. It felt like memory. The story opens on Daniel, a widowed father navigating quiet routines in a town that never quite feels awake. His daughter Emily is away for the weekend, leaving the house hollow. Only the hum of the refrigerator and the faint drip of a leaky faucet break the silence. On a drive to deliver a small parcel for work, Daniel spots a stranded woman on a rural road. Her car sits half sunken in mud, the hood raised. She waves once, but not quite like others do, careful, deliberate, as though unsure if he can see her. When Daniel pulls over, he realizes she isn't speaking. She gestures gently toward a small notepad, where she's written, "Can you help me call a tow? I can't hear." Something in her quiet steadiness disarms him. Her calm, the handwriting, the way she waits, all of it mirrors the patience his late wife once carried. He agrees to help, but as he waits beside her, the soundless rhythm of her world begins to merge with his own. The scene unfolds not through conversation, but through glances, hand movements, and the hush between them. By the time the tow truck arrives, Daniel realizes he hasn't spoken more than a few words, yet he's understood more than he has in months. A small act of help begins a quiet journey toward listening, grief, and the rediscovery of human connection. The morning light came slow, filtered through the low clouds that still held the weight of last night's rain. It wasn't bright, just enough to make the puddles shimmer across the cracked asphalt. Daniel adjusted the wipers, even though the windshield was clear. Habit. The blades squeaked once, then settled. The world outside his truck felt distant, muted, as if wrapped in cloth. Wet fields stretched out on either side, pale with fog. Fences leaned under the weight of time, their wood dark and swollen. He drove without hurry. The radio stayed off. In the passenger seat sat a thermos of coffee, half full and cooling, the same seat where his daughter's backpack usually rested. She was at her mother's parents' house for the weekend, a visit Daniel had agreed to, even though the quiet it left behind made the walls of his house feel too wide. He reached for the thermos, took a slow sip. The coffee had turned bitter. At the next turn, he noticed her. A small blue sedan, parked awkwardly on the roadside, front tire half buried in the muddy shoulder. The hood stood open, a thin column of steam rising from it like breath on a cold morning. Beside it, a woman. She stood still, one hand resting on the hood, the other clutching something white. A folded piece of paper, maybe a napkin. Her hair was damp, clinging to her coat. She wasn't waving frantically, just watching each passing car with a quiet patience that felt out of place. Daniel slowed. His tires hissed through a shallow puddle as he pulled over a few meters ahead. He sat there a moment, watching her in the side mirror. She hadn't moved. He opened the door. The air outside smelled of wet soil and the faint metallic tang of rain. His boots sank slightly into the mud as he walked toward her. "Morning," he said, voice steady but unsure. She turned to him. Her lips moved, slow and deliberate. A small shape of greeting, silent. Then she lifted the paper in her hand. In careful handwriting, dark ink slightly blurred by the damp, were the words, "Can you help me call a tow truck?" "I can't hear," he blinked, then nodded. "Of course," he said softly, pulling his phone from his pocket. "No service," he gestured with a thumb toward his truck. "There's a signal up the road. You can wait inside if you want." She hesitated, then wrote something else on the same page. "Thank you. I'm fine here." Her eyes, grey, maybe blue, held his for a moment. There was no embarrassment there, only composure, as though silence was her home and she had learned to live within it. Daniel nodded again and turned toward his truck. As he walked back, the sound of his own footsteps felt louder than it should have. He drove a short way up the hill until the bars on his phone flickered alive. The call was brief. The dispatcher said someone would be there within 40 minutes. He waited a few seconds before turning the engine off. Rain tapped faintly against the roof, a leftover drizzle returning. Through the windshield, he could still see her. A small figure beside the blue sedan, coat pressed against the wind, writing something new on her notepad. He sat there longer than needed. Something about her stillness unsettled him. Not in a fearful way, but in how familiar it felt. He'd spent months moving through that same quiet, the kind that followed loss, the kind that made noise feel intrusive. He stepped out again. When he reached her, she was kneeling by the front tire, hands dirty with streaks of mud. She looked up, then scribbled another line. Did they say how long? 40 minutes, Daniel said. He hesitated, then crouched beside her, inspecting the tire. The rim had sunk deep into the soft earth. You'll need a winch, he murmured, mostly to himself. She nodded, reading his lips easily. Then, with quick handwriting, You live nearby, a few miles west. Small house by the post road. He paused. You, she smiled faintly, shaking her head. Then wrote, Just passing through. For a few moments, neither spoke. The only sound was the low rustle of wind through wet grass and the drip of water from the open hood. Daniel leaned against the car and looked out at the horizon. The hills folding softly into one another, their tops still caught in mist. He thought of how his wife used to say mornings like this felt like unfinished prayers. Quiet, waiting to be heard. The woman stood too, dusting her hands. She caught him looking, and he looked away. After a moment, she tapped his sleeve lightly and held up the notepad again. Thank you for stopping. Most people didn't. He gave a small shrug. It's nothing. Then softer. Guess I had time to spare. She nodded once. Then, after a pause, wrote again. Sometimes people fear silence more than rain. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The line lingered between them like a shared secret neither could name. They waited together under a grey sky that never fully cleared. Daniel offered her coffee from the thermos. She accepted, holding the cup carefully, both hands steady. When she took a sip, she winced slightly. It was cold, but she nodded, as if grateful for the warmth that wasn't there. He chuckled under his breath. Guess I make better promises than coffee. She smiled, small but real. Then she wrote, It's enough. Minutes passed in quiet rhythm. A bird landed on the fence nearby, shaking droplets from its wings. A passing truck sent ripples through a puddle, the reflection of the sky trembling, reforming. When the tow finally arrived, an old flatbed truck with its logo half peeled off, Daniel stepped back as the driver got to work. The woman handed her notepad toward him one last time. Thank you again. I didn't catch your name, Daniel, he said. And you? She wrote slowly this time, as though each letter carried weight. Lena. He nodded. The driver motioned for her to step aside as he hooked the car. She turned to Daniel, hesitated, then tore a small corner from the notepad and wrote one final line before handing it to him. If you ever need silence, you know where to find it. Then she got into the tow truck. The engine roared, then faded as they disappeared down the curve of the wet road. Daniel stood there, the note in his hand growing damp from the mist. He folded it once, carefully, and slipped it into his jacket pocket. When he finally got back in his truck, he didn't start it right away. He just sat, listening to the soft ticking of the cooling engine. The road ahead was empty, but for the first time in a long while, the quiet didn't feel heavy. It felt alive. The rain didn't return that night, but the air still carried its weight. Daniel's house stood at the end of a narrow lane, the kind of place where sound had long ago learned to travel softly. He parked the truck beneath the maple tree, killed the engine, and sat a moment before going inside. The porch light flickered when he stepped up. He didn't fix it. He never did. Somehow, he preferred the uncertainty, the faint glow, the pauses between light and dark. Inside, the air was still. The clock on the wall clicked too loud, and somewhere, a tap dripped into a sink he hadn't yet repaired. He placed his jacket on the chair, the damp note still inside its pocket. He didn't take it out. He boiled water for tea, not because he wanted it, but because it gave his hands something to do. The kettle hissed, soft and steady. Steam curled like breath in the cool kitchen. On the table sat a letter, unopened. It had been there for 3 days, one of those white envelopes stamped with his late wife's handwriting. Not her hand. Of course, the school had mailed a packet of her belongings months after the accident. Her notebook, her reading glasses, and that one sealed letter she'd written for the staff, never sent. They'd found his address written faintly on the back. He couldn't bring himself to open it. Not yet. He poured the tea, took a sip, and let the bitterness settle on his tongue. Outside, the wind stirred the wet leaves, the same sound he'd heard on the roadside earlier, the kind that carried meaning, even when words didn't. He thought of the woman, Lena, her careful handwriting, the way she had written, "If you ever need silence, you know where to find it." The line played again and again in his mind, like a soft hum he couldn't turn off. He took the jacket from the chair and removed the folded note. It was crumpled, faintly damp, but still legible. He placed it beside the envelope. Two kinds of silence, he thought. One chosen, one left behind. He sat there for a long time, hands wrapped around the mug, steam rising, the clock ticking. When the tea cooled, he rose and turned off the kitchen light. He didn't go to bed right away. Instead, he stood by the window. The road beyond his yard was empty, slick under the moon. Each passing car left a faint echo, headlights sweeping across his walls, fading like memories that refused to stay gone. For the first time in months, Daniel whispered aloud. Not to anyone, just to the silence itself. "Maybe I'll write back." He didn't know what he meant, but the words settled somewhere near the truth. The next morning came with a grey sky, dry but heavy. Daniel went about his small tasks, washing dishes, checking the fence, tightening a loose hinge on the shed door. He moved slowly, not from tiredness but from habit. At noon, he took his truck into town for groceries. The same small store, the same cashier who always spoke too loudly, as if volume could make up for indifference. "How's the girl?" she asked. "Visiting her grandparents," Daniel said. The woman nodded, bagging his bread. "Quiet weekend then?" He gave a small smile. "You could say that." Outside, he noticed the public bulletin board by the store's entrance. Local ads, lost dog posters, piano lessons. Among them, a small paper caught his eye. Sign language meetup. Saturday, 6 p.m. Community Centre. A handwritten note at the bottom. For beginners too. He stood there for a moment, reading the line again. Then he folded the flyer neatly and slipped it into his pocket, right beside Lena's note. That evening, Daniel cleaned the kitchen. He didn't usually do that when Emily wasn't home, but something about the quiet felt heavier today, as if it was waiting for him to move. As he wiped the table, his elbow brushed against the letter again, the unopened one from his wife's school. The flap was beginning to curl at the edge. He picked it up, turned it over once, twice, then he set it back down. Not tonight. Instead, he pulled out a notebook from the drawer, a plain one, lined, unused. He wrote on the first page, in his own careful handwriting, "If you ever need silence, you know where to find it." He didn't know why he wrote it, maybe to see how it felt to belong to the words. He left the notebook open on the table and went to bed. The next day, he drove to the community centre. The parking lot was half empty, a few bicycles, a dusty red sedan, an old minivan with a cracked windshield. Inside, the sound of chairs scraping against the floor echoed faintly. A dozen people sat in a loose circle, some old, some young, a man with hearing aids, a woman signing to her daughter, a teenager mouthing words to an interpreter. Daniel hesitated by the door until a volunteer waved him in. "First time?" she asked. He nodded. She smiled. "You can sit anywhere. We start with introductions." He took a seat in the back. When it came his turn, he raised a hand awkwardly. "I'm Daniel," he said, then paused. "I don't know why I'm here exactly." The group smiled, not unkindly. The interpreter signed his words with graceful precision. For the next hour, they learned the basics. Names, greetings, finger spelling. Daniel's hands moved stiffly at first, his motions uncertain. But there was something steadying about it, like building sentences out of quiet. When the session ended, the instructor handed him a pamphlet. "If you're learning for someone, keep practicing," she said. He nodded. "Maybe I am." That night, Daniel sat again at the kitchen table. The letter still waited there. But this time, he didn't avoid it. He opened it slowly, the paper thin and fragile under his fingers. Inside was a short note, written in his wife's familiar looping script. "If someone ever needs your silence, give it to them fully. It's the rarest kindness." He let out a long breath. Not sadness, Not relief, just the quiet recognition of something that had been waiting to find him. He folded the letter back into its envelope, then placed Lena's note beside it. 2 messages, written by 2 different hands, somehow saying the same thing. He didn't know if he would see her again, but he began to notice the world differently. The way people spoke with gestures, the way pauses carried more weight than words. He started listening with his eyes. When Emily returned home on Sunday night, she noticed something too. "You moved the photo," she said, pointing to the mantel. "Yeah," he said. Felt like it needed light. She tilted her head. "You okay, Dad?" He nodded. "Just fixing small things," she smiled. "You always are." He looked at her, really looked, and saw how much of her mother she carried in her posture, her stillness. He reached out, brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. "Hey," he said quietly. "You want to learn something new?" "What kind of thing?" He raised his hands and signed, slowly, awkwardly. "Hello," she blinked. "What was that?" He smiled. "A start." Later, after she'd gone to bed, Daniel stood again by the window. The road outside was empty, same as before. But this time, the silence didn't feel like absence. It felt shared, like someone else might be listening too. He reached into his pocket and unfolded the note. Rain had blurred part of the ink, but the words still held. "If you ever need silence, you know where to find it." He whispered into the room. "Maybe I already have." The house didn't answer, but the quiet did, soft, steady, alive. The rain came back the next Thursday. Not in storms, just in steady threads that drew faint lines on every surface. Daniel watched it gather on the window before dawn, small rivers tracing downward. He liked how it sounded, close but far, like something trying to remember how to speak. Emily was at school. The house was quiet again. He stood in the kitchen, mug warm in his hand, eyes on the lane outside. The maple tree swayed. Beyond it, a car moved slow through the mist, its headlights cutting through the pale morning. For a second, he thought of that night on the roadside. The flares of rain. The figure standing still beside the car. He had thought of her often since then, not with longing, but with a kind of unfinished gratitude. At the community centre, the next sign language class was smaller. Maybe half the group had returned. Daniel took the same chair near the back. The instructor greeted him with a nod, fingers moving lightly as she signed. "Good to see you again," he replied, slow but certain. "Good to be here." The lesson was on emotions. How to sign sorry, thank you, understand, hope. The words felt heavier than he expected. He realized that speaking them aloud had never made him understand them. Learning to form them with his hands made him feel them. When the session ended, he stayed behind to help fold chairs. As he carried 2 toward the corner, someone entered the room, umbrella dripping, coat dark with rain. She signed something quickly to the instructor, and then looked up. Lena. Her eyes found his before her expression softened in recognition. She gave a small nod, then lifted her hand in greeting. He mirrored the gesture, his movement clumsy but sincere. The instructor looked between them, smiling faintly. "You two know each other?" Daniel hesitated. "We met on the road a while back." Lena's eyes flicked toward him, and she signed something small. The instructor interpreted gently. "She says, you gave her your jacket." He smiled. "You gave me a note." Lena's hands paused, then moved again. "Did you read it?" He nodded. Every word. The interpreter smiled again, but quietly this time, as if sensing the conversation didn't need her anymore. Lena gestured to the empty chair beside her bag. He understood. They sat together through the final minutes of cleanup, the room dimming as lights were switched off one by one. The rain tapped gently against the glass. Before leaving, Lena wrote something on her notepad and turned it toward him. "Coffee. Nearby cafe. It's quiet." The cafe was one of those small ones tucked between old buildings. Wooden tables, yellow lamps, and the soft hum of a record player. Rain streaked the window beside them. Lena ordered by pointing at the menu. Daniel followed her lead. They didn't speak much. The kind of silence that felt chosen, not awkward. When the coffees came, she pushed a napkin toward him. On it she wrote, "You started learning sign." He nodded, signing yes, trying. She smiled, small, genuine. Then wrote again, "Why?" He looked out the window for a moment. The rain blurred the streetlights into trembling halos. He wrote back, "You reminded me what listening can look like." She read the line twice, then folded the napkin slowly, as if not wanting to tear it. They stayed there nearly an hour. When conversation ran out, they simply watched the world outside. The umbrellas, the puddles, the passing faces reflected in glass. Sometimes she'd sign a word. Sometimes he'd answer with one of his own. Neither rushed to leave. When they finally did, the rain had softened to drizzle. She handed him his umbrella. He shook his head. "Keep it. I've got the truck." She tapped her chest lightly. "Thank you." He hesitated, then signed back. "See you next week." She nodded once, then wrote one more thing on her notepad and tore the page out. Silence isn't empty. It just waits for meaning. He watched her walk away through the mist. Coat dark, umbrella tilting slightly against the wind. That night, Daniel drove home slower than usual. The roads shimmered under the streetlights. When he reached the house, he didn't turn on the porch light. The rain itself felt bright enough. He placed the napkin and Lena's note on the table beside his wife's letter. 3 different kinds of handwriting, 3 ways of speaking without sound. He stared at them for a long time before opening his notebook again. Under his previous line, he wrote, "Sometimes we don't meet people. We meet echoes." He closed the notebook. The next few days passed quietly. Work, home, evening walks. Emily noticed he hummed more now, small tuneless sounds when washing dishes or folding laundry. "You're in a good mood," she said one night. He looked up. "Maybe I am. What changed?" He paused, drying his hands. "Just found someone who listens differently." She tilted her head. "Like you?" He smiled faintly. "Exactly." Saturday came with clearer skies. At the community center, Lena arrived early, notebook in hand. Daniel joined her, their lessons now more conversation than instruction. He learned how to sign story, remember, change. She taught patiently, hands slow and expressive, her gestures carrying rhythm and grace. Between lessons, she showed him how to read expressions, the lift of an eyebrow, the small pause before a gesture. "You speak with your face," she wrote once, "not just your hands." He tried. She laughed silently, eyes crinkling, and corrected him. Each time, the distance between them thinned, not with words, but with shared effort. After class, she wrote something unexpected. "Would you like to see where I work?" He nodded. They drove together, her car following his through the narrow backroads that led toward the outskirts. They stopped at a small school near the forest, a single-story building with peeling white paint and a rusted gate. Inside, the hallways were lined with children's drawings, uneven suns, stick figures, and small paper hands traced and colored. "This is where I teach," she signed proudly. He looked around. The rooms were simple. Wooden desks, posters with finger-spelling alphabets, shelves stacked with picture books. In one corner, 2 children practiced signing words to each other, giggling when they got it wrong. Lena watched them with quiet affection. Her eyes softened, the kind of look that said she didn't teach because she had to, but because the world made more sense to her in silence. Daniel watched her watching them, and in that still moment, something shifted. He understood what his wife had written. "If someone ever needs your silence, give it to them fully." He had spent months filling the quiet with noise, chores, work, memory. Now, for the first time, he felt what it meant to share it. When he dropped her back at the cafe later, she signed, "Thank you for coming." He answered, "Thank you for letting me see." They stood there a moment longer than necessary. No words, just rainlight on their faces, the air cool and unhurried. When she finally turned to go, Daniel spoke softly, not sure she'd hear it, but certain she'd understand. "See you soon." Lena. Her lips moved, slow and careful, shaping the same words back. That night, the rain returned heavier. But this time, Daniel left the window open. He let it fill the room, the steady rhythm washing through the dark. He lay awake, thinking of her hands shaping meaning out of air, of children signing sunlight and laughter, of the small ways people learn to reach one another. And somewhere between the sound of rain and breath, he realized the world hadn't grown quieter. He had. The mornings began to hold light differently. It wasn't brighter, just clearer, as if the world had been rinsed and left to dry. Daniel noticed it most in the small things. The way steam rose from his mug, how the window's frost melted in soft streaks, how Emily's laughter now carried further down the hall. Silence had stopped being heavy. It had started to feel like space. At the community center, the tables had been rearranged in a circle that week. A few new faces joined. young volunteers, an older man with careful eyes, and Lena, early as always, setting up flashcards. When Daniel arrived, she waved, her hand firm and steady, her expression almost bright. He sat beside her, laying his notebook open. The first lesson word written across the board was connection. Lena pointed to it, then signed slowly, shaping each motion with deliberate care. He copied, slower but certain. She nodded, not to correct, but to affirm. They continued through the morning. Trust, patience, grief, remember. Every sign had a rhythm, a breath hidden in motion. He learned that to say grief, your hands fold and draw inward, as if carrying something unseen. To say remember, you touch your forehead, then pull the memory gently down to your heart. No dictionary had told him that. Only her hands did. During a break, they sat by the window. The rain outside was softer today, a mist that blurred the streets into watercolor. Lena scribbled something on her notepad. Do you ever miss the noise? He thought for a while before answering. Sometimes, but it used to be louder in my head than outside. She read it twice, then wrote beneath, now. He smiled faintly. Now I think I finally hear people. She didn't write anything back, just looked at him for a long moment. Then she signed slowly, you listen with your eyes. It wasn't a compliment, it was a truth. That afternoon, Lena invited him to a small gathering at the school. Children's performance. The interpreter had explained before. End of term. Daniel almost declined. He wasn't good with crowds. But when Lena added, they'd like someone who can hear music, he agreed. The classroom had been cleared of desks, replaced by folding chairs and a paper banner that read, Voices of Hands. Parents gathered along the back wall, coats dripping, eyes watchful and proud. Lena stood at the front beside a dozen children. They began to sign a song, not with words, but with movement so exact it felt like choreography. Each motion rose and fell in time, with the faint piano playing from a speaker. Daniel watched their hands paint the air, sunlight, river, home together. He didn't understand every sign, but he understood the feeling. The music faded before the last verse. Yet the children continued, finishing the song in silence. It was the most complete sound he'd ever heard. Afterward, the children ran around laughing, tugging at Lena's sleeve for attention. One of them, a girl with a red ribbon in her hair, pointed toward Daniel. She signed something fast. Lena smiled, then translated. She says you look like her dad when he listens. Daniel chuckled quietly. How does he listen? Lena shaped her hands, resting them lightly near her chest. Still, with all of him. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. They left the school together near dusk. Rain had paused. Only the smell of wet earth remained. They walked without umbrellas, following the road that curved behind the field. After a while, Lena took out her notepad again and wrote, You still keep her letter? He looked at her surprised. How do you know about that? You wrote it in your notebook last week. I saw the word letter, he nodded. Yes, it's the last thing she wrote. She hesitated, then wrote again. Can I read it? Daniel thought for a long time. Then he said quietly, Yes. They reached the truck parked beneath a lone streetlight. The air was cool, the sky pale with leftover rain. He opened the glove compartment, took out the folded page. Edges softened from touch, creases white with years. He handed it to her carefully. Like something still alive, she unfolded it, tracing each word with her finger as she read. When she reached the end, if someone ever needs your silence, give it to them fully. She looked up, eyes damp from light, not from sorrow. Her hands moved slowly, shaping the words. She understood what I understand now. Daniel nodded. What's that? She wrote it instead of signing it. That silence isn't absence. It's another kind of closeness. He read the line twice. The rain began again. Faint, but enough to make the air hum. He said nothing, but left the window cracked open as they sat there, side by side, listening. Over the next few weeks, their quiet became routine. Sometimes they met at the cafe, sometimes at the school. They spoke with hands, notebooks, and pauses that said more than words. Once, she told him how she lost her hearing, not through tragedy, but through time. It had been fading since childhood. People thought I was ignoring them, she wrote. I wasn't. I just couldn't hear the difference between care and noise. Daniel didn't respond for a while. Then he signed. I used to ignore the difference too. Her lips curved faintly, not quite a smile, but close enough to feel like light. One day she asked him to stay after class. He helped carry chairs to storage, the air warm with late sunlight. When they finished, she took her phone, typed something quickly, and showed him the screen. Would you help me record the children's next song? He nodded. Of course. She signed. But you'll need to be the one who hears it. He frowned slightly. What do you mean? I want them to see music through you. He didn't answer right away. Then he said softly, all right, we'll make it happen. The following week, the classroom became a small studio. He brought microphones, borrowed from his workplace. The children practiced signing in rhythm. Daniel watched, learning their timing, counting beats aloud they couldn't hear. Each gesture was precise, alive, their faces bright with unspoken melody. When the camera started recording, Lena stood behind it. Daniel counted softly, 1, 2, 3, and raised his hand. The children began. There was no sound for most people watching, but for him, every movement was music, and he realized that perhaps hearing was never the point. When they finished, Lena turned off the camera and looked at him. Her eyes were shining, steady, alive. She signed, you helped them be heard. He answered, no, they helped me listen. That evening, after the children left, Lena stayed behind to clean up. Daniel lingered by the door. You need a ride? He asked. She nodded. The drive was slow, the road lined with silver puddles. Halfway through, she tapped his arm and signed, stop here. They pulled over beside a field, wide, empty, glowing faintly under the moon. She stepped out, the grass whispering under her shoes. Then she gestured for him to follow. In the distance, fireflies moved like quiet sparks. She stood still for a long time, eyes closed, breathing. He watched her hands rise slightly, palms open, the gesture for thank you. For what? He asked gently. She wrote in her notebook, slow and deliberate, forgiving silence back its sound. They didn't speak after that. They just stood there, two silhouettes in a field, the night humming softly around them. A faint wind passed, carrying the smell of rain and cut grass. When he finally turned to leave, she touched his arm lightly, not to stop him, just to say, go gently. He nodded, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like something was missing when he walked away. He felt full, not with answers, but with the kind of peace that doesn't need one. That night, Daniel placed the letter, the napkin, and her new note together in his notebook. He stared at the three, each one a fragment of the same language. He turned off the lamp and whispered into the dark. Not for anyone to hear, but for silence itself. Thank you for waiting. Winter arrived like an afterthought, slow, deliberate, and without ceremony. The mornings were pale now, frost clung to Daniel's window, and the air held the kind of stillness that made sound feel unnecessary. He'd begun teaching part-time at the community centre. Mechanical basics, repair workshops for anyone willing to learn. It wasn't much, but it filled the hours with purpose. Sometimes, between classes, he'd pass the sign language room and see Lena there, hands moving through sentences that danced in rhythm with her breath. He'd linger by the doorway for a second too long, just long enough to feel something shift quietly in the air. On one of those mornings, she caught him watching. Her hand paused mid-motion. Then she signed, "You're late for your class." He nodded, smiling faintly. I was early for something else. Her brow lifted, a question, but she didn't ask it. Instead, she pointed toward the coffee pot near the corner. Coffee. He nodded again. They sat in the staff room, mismatched mugs, flickering fluorescent light, and the faint hum of an old heater. No one else was there. Lena took out her notebook and wrote, "Do you ever think about leaving this town?" Daniel leaned back. "I used to, before. Before what?" He looked at her, then toward the window where frost patterns gathered like veins of light. "Before I started listening again." She read his lips carefully, her expression softening. Then she signed, "Sometimes staying is harder than leaving." He nodded. "That's why it matters." The days grew shorter, the silence between them longer, but not empty. It had weight, texture, like snow before it falls. At the school, Lena had begun preparing her students for a winter showcase. Silent stories, she'd written on the board, told entirely through hands. She asked Daniel to help with lighting, soft amber for warmth, cool blue for reflection. He spent the week adjusting angles, taping chords, and watching her rehearse with the children. He noticed how she guided them, never forcing, only reminding. A nod, a tilt of her hand, a small breath when they got it right. She taught like someone translating grace into motion. One evening, as they tested the stage lights, the power flickered and went out. The room sank into dim twilight. Daniel sighed. Transformer again. Give me a second. He found a flashlight and returned to find Lena standing in the faint beam, her face half lit, her hands resting loosely by her sides. She signed slowly. The dark doesn't bother me. I know, he said quietly. But I still want to fix it. You always do, she signed, a ghost of a smile. He hesitated, the beam steady in his hand. Maybe it's all I know how to do. She wrote on a small scrap of paper, her handwriting narrow and angled. Maybe fixing isn't about things. Maybe it's about staying until the noise fades. He folded the paper carefully and placed it in his coat pocket, without a word. The showcase came a week later. Snow fell through the afternoon, turning the streets to soft mirrors. Parents arrived carrying scarves and thermoses, brushing the cold from their coats. Daniel helped adjust the last light. Lena stood backstage with the children, her movements calm, eyes bright with quiet pride. When the curtain lifted, no music played, only the children, their hands speaking in patterns of wind and river, house and heartbeat. Each gesture glowed under the warm light Daniel had set earlier. Each pause carried the hush of something sacred. And then, during the final act, Lena joined them. She stepped forward, signing a story Daniel didn't know. But he could feel it. A woman waiting by a window, a letter left unread, a world that kept turning, quietly forgiving her for still missing what was gone. He realized, somewhere near the end, that she wasn't performing. She was remembering. When she finished, the audience didn't clap immediately. They just sat there, breathing in the silence she'd created. Then, slowly, hands rose, not to clap, but to wave, the deaf applause filling the air like soft wind. Afterward, Daniel found her backstage. She was collecting scarves, folding costumes. The hum of the heater filled the silence. He said quietly, "You told a story tonight." She looked up, unsure if he meant it as praise or question. He added, "It felt like something you'd been waiting to say." Her eyes softened. She signed, "It was my mother's story." He nodded slowly. "The letter?" She shook her head. "No letter, just silence. We stopped understanding each other when I lost my hearing." He waited. She tried to speak louder. I tried to listen harder. Neither worked. Lena looked away, her breath fogging faintly in the cold. "She died before I learned how to sign goodbye." Daniel's throat tightened. He wanted to say something. Anything. But words felt clumsy in the space she'd made sacred. So instead, he raised his hand slowly, and he signed, careful but sure. "Goodbye can still mean thank you." She blinked. Once, sharply. Then she placed her hand over his, pressing lightly. "Then thank you." She signed back. Snow kept falling late into the night. They walked outside together after the hall emptied. The town was quiet, streetlights humming, snow turning every sound soft. Lena tilted her head back, catching a snowflake on her glove. Her lips moved, not words, but the shape of breath. Daniel watched. "What are you saying?" She smiled faintly and signed, "I said listen." "To what?" She turned, gesturing to the air around them. "To how silence moves." He closed his eyes. The world wasn't still. It was whispering in 1,000 small ways. The snow landing, the street lamp buzzing, his own heart steady against the cold. When he opened his eyes, she was already watching him. He didn't say anything. He just nodded. A few days later, he found a note on his doorstep. Lena's handwriting, familiar and calm. "They offered me a teaching post in the city. I haven't decided, but I wanted to tell you before the silence did." He read it twice, then once more, his breath visible in the cold. There was no address, no request, no promise. Just a quiet truth. The kind that leaves space for both staying and leaving. He placed the note on his kitchen table beside her earlier scrap of paper. The two lay side by side. A conversation continued in ink. That evening, Daniel drove to the bridge that overlooked the frozen river. He parked, turned off the engine, and let the world fall quiet again. He thought of Lena's hands, how they spoke with a patience the world rarely earned. He thought of his daughter, of the note that had once told him to give silence fully, and for the first time he understood what that meant. Giving silence wasn't about absence, it was about staying, even when there were no more words left to share. When he returned home, he left the porch light on, not for anyone specific, just for the next quiet arrival. He sat by the window, watching the snow drift sideways in the wind. The world, he realized, would always find its way back to stillness. The only choice was whether he met it with emptiness or attention. He whispered, almost without sound, "Wherever you go, may you still be heard." The clock in the kitchen ticked. Somewhere outside, a car passed, leaving soft tire marks through the snow. And for the first time, Daniel didn't listen for what was missing. He just listened. The morning after Lena's note, the town felt hollow. Not empty, just quieter, as if every sound hesitated before breaking the air. Daniel woke early, out of habit, but stayed sitting on the edge of his bed. The letter lay on the table where he'd left it. He hadn't moved it. He couldn't. Outside, the street was pale with frost, the kind that turned breath into smoke and thoughts into ghosts. He poured coffee, didn't drink it, and stared at the window's reflection, the faint shape of a man who had learned too late how to listen. At the workshop, everything sounded wrong. The hammer struck too sharply. The radio's static filled the corners where conversation used to live. Even the clock ticked louder, impatient. He adjusted the same bolt 3 times before realizing it didn't need fixing. Around noon, Mrs. Calloway from the centre stopped by. "Daniel," she said, brushing snow from her scarf. "Lena asked me to give you this before she left." He blinked. "She's gone?" "She said she might come back. But she wanted you to have this, either way." She handed him a small, worn cassette tape, the kind you could record over 100 times but never erase completely. He turned it in his hands. "She knows I don't even have a player for this." Mrs. Calloway smiled softly. "Maybe that's the point." That evening, Daniel found his old tape deck buried in a box of tools and wires, relics from before everything fell apart. He cleaned the dust off the buttons, pressed play, and waited. For a moment, there was nothing but static. Then, a faint hum. A chair creaked. Someone exhaled. Then her voice. "Daniel, if you're hearing this, I guess I finally said goodbye properly." A pause, breath-catching, uncertain. "I wanted to tell you something I never could in person. You listen too hard sometimes. You think silence is something to fix." He froze. The tape hissed gently. "But silence isn't broken. It's a place. Sometimes it's where people go when words can't carry them anymore. That's where I live. That's where I met you." He sat down, elbows on his knees, the tape spinning softly in the dark. "I used to think losing my hearing was the worst thing that happened to me. But then I met people who could hear everything and still never listened. You weren't one of them. You waited. That's what I'll remember." The tape clicked off mid-breath, the end of a side. He didn't turn it over. He just sat there until the house felt smaller than it ever had before. Days passed. The workshop, the centre, the empty streets, all blurred into a rhythm of waiting. Then one afternoon, while cleaning the classroom she'd used, Daniel found a small folded sheet of paper wedged behind the cabinet. Her handwriting again. Lesson 12. Listening without sound. Underneath, a line written in larger letters. "You can't hear silence, but you can learn its shape." He stared at it, something between ache and warmth spreading through his chest. Then, below that, almost as an afterthought, "P.S. I left something for you in the storeroom." He frowned, then went to check. Behind a stack of chairs, covered in a sheet, was a small wooden box. Inside, dozens of small cards, each with a single sign drawn in black marker, paired with one English word: kindness. Stay. Wait. Hear. Forgive. On the very last card, no word, just the sign for thank you. That night, he couldn't sleep. He laid the cards out on his table like a puzzle, each one a fragment of their conversations. Then he began to sign them in sequence, slow and deliberate, as though speaking to an invisible room. By the end, his hands trembled, not from age, but from the weight of remembering. Weeks turned into months. The snow melted. The town's rhythm returned, cautious laughter at the cafe, distant trains again cutting through the evening stillness. Daniel kept teaching. He added a small course to his workshop schedule, listening beyond sound. No one quite knew what it meant, but the classes filled faster than he expected. He taught what Lena had taught him, not signs or words, but pauses. He'd tell them, "Most people hear to reply, try hearing to stay." Some got it, most didn't. But that was fine. It wasn't meant for everyone. One afternoon, as he packed his tools, a young girl from the class approached. She was about 10, hair tied in uneven braids, holding a small notepad. She wrote, "My mum says you talk to the air sometimes. Are you okay?" Daniel smiled faintly. "Yeah," he said. "The air listens better than most people." She giggled. "Can you teach me too?" "Teach you what?" "How to listen like that." He thought for a long moment, then nodded. "Sure. But it takes practice." "How much practice?" He smiled. "A lifetime." Spring arrived with a kind of fragile mercy. One morning, as Daniel walked past the post office, he noticed a small parcel addressed to him. No return name, just a city stamp. Inside was a photograph. It showed a classroom, new walls, bright windows, and Lena standing in front of a small group of students. She was mid-sign, a blur of movement, but her smile was unmistakable. On the back, one line written in her handwriting. "The silence here sounds familiar." He held the photo for a long time before sliding it into his jacket pocket. That evening, he returned to the bridge. The river had thawed, reflecting the last light of sunset, gold trembling on water. He stood there for a while, the photograph warm in his hand, and whispered, "You made it." No answer, of course, just the faint murmur of the river moving somewhere unseen, and for the first time since the tape, that felt enough. Weeks later, the community centre announced a small exhibit, Hands That Speak. It was Lena's idea, sent from the city, and Daniel was asked to help set it up. He spent 3 days arranging framed photos of students signing, hands caught mid-motion, faces open and unguarded. Near the centre of the display, he hung her photo, the same one she'd mailed him, and beneath it, a small plaque. "Silence isn't the absence of sound. It's the space where kindness breathes." People stopped to read it. Some nodded. Some didn't understand. But everyone went quiet for a moment longer than usual. That was enough. When the evening ended and the hall emptied, Daniel lingered near her photo. The janitor turned off the change lights one row at a time, shadows stretching across the floor. He looked up at her picture, her hands mid-sign, caught between word and meaning, and whispered, "You were right. It was never about fixing." Then, without really thinking, he signed the word, "Stay." Outside, the air was cool, threaded with rain. The sound of it on the pavement was soft, patient, like a conversation continuing somewhere far away. Daniel walked home with his hands in his pockets, the night neither loud nor quiet, just right. When he reached his porch, he paused, looking at the light he'd left on months ago. He didn't turn it off. Instead, he stood there a while, letting the silence speak first. Spring had almost settled by then. Not the sudden kind that arrives in colour, but the hesitant kind that tiptoes across mornings before anyone notices. Daniel's porch was covered in small yellow leaves, soft as paper scraps. He sat at his old workbench, an envelope in front of him, blank, waiting. It had been years since he'd written anything by hand that wasn't a receipt or a name on a job order. But tonight, something about the stillness felt like permission. He turned on the small desk lamp, its light cutting a circle into the dark. Outside, rain started again, thin, steady, like the sound of someone breathing through sleep. He picked up the pen. It hesitated the way his voice once had. "Dear Sarah," he stopped. The pen hovered over the page. It felt strange to write her name again, not because he'd forgotten it, but because it sounded alive when written down. He started again. "Dear Sarah, I don't know where to start. Maybe that's why I never tried before. When you left, I thought silence was my punishment. I thought if I stayed quiet long enough, maybe I'd deserve to hear you again. Then I met someone who couldn't hear at all. And she showed me that silence isn't a wall. It's a bridge if you're patient enough to walk across it." He paused, looked at his hands. They trembled slightly, not from age but from memory. Her name was Lena. She didn't say much, but she showed me how to listen again. She made me realize that I wasn't angry because you were gone. I was angry because I didn't get to say everything I should have while you were here. You once asked me why I never talked about Mom. I didn't know how to tell you that every word felt like breaking glass in my throat, so I stopped talking. Then you stopped asking, and somewhere between those silences, we lost each other. The rain deepened outside. The lamp flickered once, then steadied. He kept writing. Lena taught me that not every silence means absence. Some silences hold what words can't handle. She wrote me a note once. It said, "You listen too hard sometimes." I didn't understand it then, but now I do. I think I was listening for your voice, not your memory. I was waiting to hear you say something that would let me stop feeling guilty. But maybe you already did, just not in words. He looked out the window. The streetlight hummed softly, the rain catching its glow like dust floating through time. He wrote slower now, every line a release. "You know, I fixed that old radio you used to love. It doesn't play music anymore, just static. But sometimes, when the house gets too quiet, I turn it on anyway. It reminds me that even noise can be gentle if you let it. If you were here, you'd probably laugh at me trying to learn sign language. I'm still terrible at it. But I keep practicing, not because I need it for work, because I like what it teaches me about waiting. Patience isn't something you learn from talking. It's something you learn from listening." He paused again, looking at the ink where it began to smudge. He pressed his thumb gently on the spot, leaving a faint mark, a fingerprint in place of a word. "I wanted to tell you that I finally forgave myself, not for what happened. That's not something you fix, but for staying quiet too long. And I wanted to thank you, because meeting her helped me hear you again. Not your voice, just you. You're still here, in every quiet thing that stays behind after sound." He signed it simply, Dad. He sat there for a while, the pen still in his hand, the letter cooling in the air. Then he folded it, slid it into the envelope, and wrote her name on the front, Sarah. He didn't add an address. There was nowhere to send it. Instead, he walked outside. The night was damp and full of the smell of rain-soaked wood. The river nearby murmured in the dark, steady like breath. He walked to the bridge, the same bridge where Lena had stood that first day. The water below caught the streetlight, a silver thread weaving through black. He held the letter a moment longer, then let it fall. It didn't sink immediately. It floated, drifting with the current, the ink starting to blur under the rain. He whispered, barely audible, "You can rest now." The wind caught his words and carried them somewhere beyond hearing. When he returned home, he placed the cassette tape Lena had given him back into the player and pressed play. Static again, then the faint sound of her moving, the creak of a chair, the rustle of paper. Her voice came through, quiet, familiar. "If you're listening again, Daniel, then maybe you finally heard it." Then silence, but this time it didn't ache. It settled, soft, like dust on wood, like morning light through curtains. The next day, he reopened the workshop. He pinned Lena's Lesson 12 note on the wall. "You can't hear silence, but you can learn its shape." And beneath it, he added one more line in his own handwriting. "I finally did." That evening, the sun dipped low across the town. Children rode bicycles past his shop, laughter skipping like stones on water. He watched them from the doorway, Arms crossed, face calm. The sky burned orange, fading to blue. For a moment, everything stood still. Then a gust of wind carried the faint chime of the bell above the door, the sound so light it might have been imagined. He smiled, not because of what it meant, but because it was enough. The silence after lingered, whole, full, alive. The world doesn't always speak, but sometimes silence remembers for us. In the space between words, we learn what care really sounds like. Not loud, not certain, just steady. A widowed father, a deaf woman, a quiet note. And somewhere in their silence, the shape of forgiveness finally took form.